Classic dissociative is the first structural type of borderline. The next one is the psychopathic borderline, the dark personality borderline. It's a borderline that tends to be violent and aggressive more than usual. And borderlines are factor 2 psychopaths in one of their self-states. One of the self-states or pseudo-identities or sub-personalities of a borderline is invariably a psychopath. In the psychopathic borderline, this self-state is a primary psychopath. In the classic borderline, this self-state is a secondary psychopath. And there is the antisocial borderline. Now, Robert Hare made a distinction between factor 1 psychopathy and factor 2 psychopathy. Factor 2 psychopathy has to do with behaviors, and factor 2 psychopathy presumably also has empathy and a modicum of emotion, a modicum of empathy and some emotions, including positive emotions. A psychopath borderline is socio-sexually unrestricted. She has low sexual disgust, so she is very open to sleep with total strangers. She engages in behaviors like compulsive sexting, transactional sex, and she's generally speaking promiscuous. While the distinguishing or differential feature of the psychopathic borderline is aggression and violence, the distinguishing or the differential feature of the antisocial borderline is unboundaried, dysregulated sexuality, a form of non-autonomous, in effect, promiscuity. I called it the covert borderline. Covert borderline is actually a narcissistic borderline and seeming self-sufficiency. He has mood lability, like the classic borderline. He has emotional dysregulation and rationalization of reactance, defiance, and contumaciousness. In this sense, he has elements of the classic borderline, the dysregulation, and elements of the psychopathic borderline. He's defiant, he's reactant, he's reckless, and he hates or rejects authority. He's contumacious. The covert borderline has a low threshold for boredom, low tolerance for boredom. He can't tolerate boredom. And when he's very, very bored, he does crazy things. He tends to externalize his impulses, his urges, for example, his aggression, and then internalize it. So first he externalizes it. He has no suicidal ideation, unlike the borderline. And his aggression is other-directed, as I said, externalized. There's no self-mutilation, as distinct from the classic borderline. There is, however, hypochondriasis and addictive behaviors. The covert borderline, exactly like the classic borderline, has dissociative self-states, mainly selective attention, confabulation, repression or denial, and a primary psychopathic protector. Lack of real empathy. When the covert borderline is in the narcissistic or primary psychopathic phase, when he switches to this self-state, he has no real empathy. He has no empathy. This is not true of the classic borderline. It's the classic borderline, when she switches to secondary psychopathy, maintains her empathy and her emotions. That's why afterwards, after the secondary psychopathic phase or self-state, she feels regret and shame. What differentiates the psychopath from the borderline is the ability to experience remorse and shame. And so the psychopathic borderline is very conflicted in this sense, because she has a dominant factor 1 psychopathic self-state and a dominant borderline state. One of them has no empathy, one of them has empathy, one of them has no emotions, one of them has too many emotions, which are too intense and overpowering, overwhelming, and dysregulating emotions. And so the two entities, the two self-states in the psychopathic borderline are incompatible. They're constantly fighting.